in the grand theater of international relations. Where nations once relied on carefully choreographed diplomatic ballet, a new protagonist has emerged on the global stage. The Trump administration has transformed the humble tariff, traditionally a mere instrument of economic policy, into something far more formidable, a weapon of coercive diplomacy that cuts through the delicate fabric of international protocol, like a steel blade through silk. This shift represents not merely a change in trade policy, but a fundamental reimagining of how one superpower chooses to project its influence across the interconnected web of global commerce. The evolution of tariffs from simple trade barriers to geopolitical cudgels tells a story of power, pressure, and the deliberate abandonment of diplomatic niceties. Where previous administrations might have dispatched ambassadors with carefully crafted proposals, or convened multilateral summits to address international disagreements, the current approach wields economic punishment with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel and the bluntness of a medieval mace. This transformation has created ripple effects that extend far beyond mere percentage points on imported goods, reshaping the very language through which nations communicate their displeasure, their demands, and their expectations. The mechanics of this coercive diplomacy are both elegant and brutal in their simplicity. When a nation fails to align with American interests, or when diplomatic channels prove insufficiently persuasive, the threat of punitive tariffs emerges as the new diplomatic vocabulary. The president's current target, India, has been unable to reach a trade agreement, and Trump appears ready to follow through with his threat to impose a further 25% tariff on Delhi, bringing the total to 50%. This represents not merely an economic disagreement, but a calculated demonstration of how commercial relationships can become hostage to political compliance. India's predicament illustrates the complex web of expectations that now govern international relations under this new paradigm. The world's largest democracy finds itself caught between its sovereign right to pursue independent foreign policy decisions and the crushing weight of potential economic consequences. The tariff threats against India encompass not only trade disputes, but also pressure regarding its energy purchases from Russia, demonstrating how economic coercion can extend into areas traditionally considered matters of national security and strategic autonomy. This expansion of tariff justifications, beyond simple trade imbalances, represents a fundamental shift in how economic tools are deployed for geopolitical ends. Brazil, the vibrant heart of South America and a crucial player in global commodity markets, has similarly found itself ensnared in this new web of economic diplomacy. By May 2025, according to statements released by Brazilian Finance Minister Fernando Haddad, Brazil and the United States were negotiating the terms of an understanding on tariffs. On July 9, 2025, Trump announced that the United States would impose a 50% tariff on Brazilian goods. The trajectory from negotiation to punishment reveals the precarious nature of international relationships when economic leverage becomes the primary tool of statecraft, where even good faith negotiations offer no guarantee of protection from punitive measures. Perhaps nowhere is this new diplomatic reality more starkly illustrated than in the case of Canada, America's northern neighbor and traditionally one of its closest allies. The relationship between these two nations, bound by geography, history, and extensive economic integration, has become a laboratory for testing the limits of coercive diplomacy. The threat comes one day before Trump's August 1 deadline for countries to make a trade deal with the USA or face tariffs. In Canada's case, a 35% levy on goods imported from the North American neighbor and significant trading partner. The use of arbitrary deadlines and ultimatums represents a departure from the patient, consensus-building approach that has traditionally characterized North American relations. The Canadian situation becomes even more complex when viewed through the lens of diplomatic principle versus economic pragmatism. On the eve of his latest tariff deadline, USA President Donald Trump says Canada's decision to recognize a Palestinian state will hurt the urgent trade talks underway between the two countries. This direct connection between foreign policy positions and trade relationships illustrates how economic coercion has expanded beyond traditional commercial disputes to encompass virtually any area where national interests might diverge. The implicit message is clear. Alignment with American foreign policy preferences becomes a prerequisite for favorable economic treatment. The Palestinian statehood issue serves as a particularly illuminating case study in how non-economic diplomatic positions can trigger economic consequences. Canada's decision to recognize Palestinian statehood, a matter of international law and humanitarian principle in the eyes of many nations, suddenly becomes grounds for trade penalties. This conflation of separate diplomatic spheres represents a significant departure from traditional diplomatic practice, where nations could disagree on some issues, while maintaining cooperation on others. The new paradigm demands comprehensive alignment across all policy areas, or risk economic punishment. Traditional diplomacy, with its emphasis on patient negotiation, mutual respect for sovereignty, and the ability to compartmentalize disagreements, appears increasingly obsolete in this new environment. The gradual degradation of these diplomatic norms has profound implications for international stability and cooperation. Where once nations could engage in prolonged discussions, building understanding through cultural exchange, economic partnerships, and multilateral forums, the current approach demands immediate compliance or faces swift economic retribution. This shift from persuasion to coercion fundamentally alters the psychology of international relations. The broader pattern of this coercive diplomacy extends far beyond individual bilateral relationships to encompass entire regions and multilateral organizations. This move is not isolated. It fits into a broader pattern of coercive diplomacy: punitive tariffs on India, Brazil, and China, potential secondary sanctions targeting Russian energy buyers, and a precarious attempt to preserve a tactical trade truce with Beijing. The systematic nature of these policies suggests not random acts of economic aggression, but a carefully orchestrated strategy to reshape global power dynamics through the strategic application of economic pressure. The implications for smaller nations and developing economies are particularly profound. When major powers deploy tariffs as diplomatic weapons, it creates an environment where economic vulnerability becomes political vulnerability. Nations must constantly calculate not only the economic costs of their policy decisions, but also the potential for punitive trade measures. This dynamic fundamentally alters the sovereignty equation, where independent decision-making becomes a luxury that only the most economically self-sufficient nations can afford. The global trading system, built over decades on the foundation of predictable rules and multilateral agreements, finds itself under unprecedented strain. The World Trade Organization and other international bodies designed to mediate trade disputes suddenly appear inadequate when faced with tariffs deployed not for economic reasons, but as tools of political coercion. This erosion of institutional frameworks for international commerce threatens to return global trade to a more primitive, power-based system where might determines commercial rights. For multinational corporations and global supply chains, this new reality creates unprecedented uncertainty. Business decisions that once could be made based on economic efficiency and market dynamics now must factor in the political relationships between governments and the potential for sudden, dramatic changes in trade conditions. The predictability that global commerce requires for long-term planning becomes a casualty of this approach, too. International relations, the psychological impact on the international community extends beyond immediate economic consequences. The threat of tariffs creates a climate of perpetual uncertainty, where nations must constantly evaluate their positions, not only on their merits, but through the lens of potential American economic retaliation. This dynamic fundamentally alters the nature of international discourse, privileging compliance over principle and economic pragmatism over sovereign decision-making. As this new era of tariff-based diplomacy continues to unfold, the international community grapples with fundamental questions about the future of global cooperation, the degradation of traditional diplomatic methods, the weaponization of economic relationships, and the demand for comprehensive political alignment represent not merely policy shifts, but a transformation in the very nature of how nations relate to one another. Whether this approach ultimately strengthens American influence or undermines the cooperative frameworks essential for addressing global challenges remains an open question, one whose answer will shape the trajectory of international relations for generations to come. The story of tariffs as geopolitical weapons thus becomes a cautionary tale about the fragility of international cooperation and the ease with which economic interdependence can be transformed from a source of mutual benefit into a tool of unilateral coercion. In this new landscape, the patient art of diplomacy gives way to the blunt instrument of economic pressure, forever altering the delicate balance of power and principle that has long governed the community of nations. As we witness this fundamental transformation in how nations relate to one another, the implications stretch far beyond the immediate impact on trade flows and diplomatic protocols. We are living through a pivotal moment in history, where the rules of international engagement are being rewritten in real time, with consequences that will ripple through generations of global relationships. The question that emerges from this analysis is not merely whether such tactics prove effective in the short term, but whether they contribute to a more stable, prosperous world, or push us toward a more fractured, unpredictable international order. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the evolving landscape of global diplomacy and economic statecraft. If this analysis has provided you with valuable insights into the complex dynamics shaping our world today, please take a moment to share this content with others who might benefit from understanding these critical developments. Do not forget to subscribe to West is Best for more comprehensive examinations of the forces reshaping international relations, geopolitical strategy, and the intricate dance of power that determines the fate of nations in our interconnected world.